We've sowed our seeds and they've sprouted. Now what? This is our part 3 of our seed starting series, How to Care for Our Young Seedlings. Some things that we're going to be going over is bumping up our seedlings, artificial light, why they need circulation, plus the proper way to fertilize our young seedlings. 10 days ago in our seed starting series, part 2, I used several different methods of sowing seeds. I used flats for sowing hundreds of onion seeds, cells, little pots, and the little window greenhouse kit. And as you can see that we've already got seeds coming up, especially the cool season crops. Then we have the peppers that are just starting to pop through, and the tomatoes are just coming up as well. So we've got different stages here that we're going to take care of today. One thing that I think is really cool and worth noting is growing on a heat mat really speeds things up. This little guy here was started at the same time that this was. Now this only had 2 seeds in it and this had several, but you can see the big difference of using a heat mat versus not using a heat mat. Warming that soil temperature up really helps speed up the germination process and helps them to grow a little bit faster. This pot here is one that we started several seeds. In fact, I think I used an entire seed packet in this single pot. And now it's time to prick them out. If we leave them in this pot too long, then the roots are going to get tangled up and they're not going to be very healthy. So at this point where they've got their cotyledon leaves, it's time to separate them out and get them into their own little space. We want to use the same soil that we started these in. Unless you used a vermiculite base, then that's not enough. And so you want to use a potting soil or mix your own soil, one that we talked about in our part 1 of this series. So now we're going to prick these guys apart and then give them their own space. This is a little seedling that has its cotyledon leaves, which are the first leaves that emerge up out of the soil, and then this is the set of true leaves that it first get. Get your pots together, whatever you choose to use, and then get your soil prepared as well. You want your soil to be evenly moist before you add it to your pots, because if you add it when it's dry, it can act a little hydrophobic. Plus, having it evenly moist makes it to where your transplants can adapt a little bit easier to that moist soil. Once that's all added to the brim, then go ahead and pop some holes in the center of each one of these little pots. You can use like a back of a marker, you can use a dibber, or you can even use your finger. And once you've done that, you want to take your little seedlings out and then you're going to tease them apart really carefully. You don't want them to break. They're very tender at this stage, and you want to pick the most robust and healthy looking starts. We want to be really careful not to break these real tender little stems, because if we break them, obviously they're not going to work. But there's been times in the past where they've been kind of broke, but not all the way through, and I've actually used these in a pinch when I've had few seeds, and they will grow, but they've always been kind of weakly, and then they're real susceptible to disease and pests. So it's really a good idea just to cull these out and not even use them. When we put these little guys in their holes, we want to make sure that they're going deeper than their original pot, as long as we're not covering the leaves. And then once we put them down in the holes, then we're going to just bring in that soil just a little bit, and then we're going to lightly water these little seedlings to get them off to a good start. I always have some left over after I've done all of my transplants, and I save these for 1 to 2 weeks. That way, if I have any casualties, I can pop one of these guys in the place of the one that died off. Also, we want to make sure that we're going to keep these nice and moist throughout their growing season. They'll remain in these pots until they're transplanted outside. The cells are done basically the same way. They're just a little bit easier because we don't have to tease those little roots apart and we have less chance of damaging them. So this is a great way for beginners. So we just prepare our soil the same way, use a dibbler to make a nice big hole, pop them out right into that. But these are a little too young. We want to make sure that they're a little bit bigger, have a nice root system, and that they have their first set of true leaves at least. And make sure that they're not root bound as well. If they end up getting too much root system in there, then you have to tease that apart, and that just causes some stress and sets them back just a little bit. So there's no reason to do that. Now, some of these we might let get big enough and then transplant right out into the garden. Same rule goes. We don't want them to be root bound. Like these beets, I don't even need to separate these because beets, they really do good in groups of 3 or 4, and then just pop these little cells right out into the garden as long as we've hardened them off correctly. And we'll show you that a little bit later. But these will go right into the garden without even a transplant. The different types of cells definitely have some advantages. Like this little guy here, he has some larger holes down at the bottom that I can actually just pry them up or give them a little bit of pressure on the bottom, and it pops that seedling right out without causing any damage. Now, if you're using the styrofoam, you have to be a little bit more careful because sometimes the roots almost get stuck into the styrofoam, and that's why I'm preferring the plastic these days. But we've got them, so we're going to use them. So you have to use a little tool to actually pry them right up out of here. Now you can see on this guy here, his root system hasn't developed yet. So this would be way too early to be transplanting. For the pots that we sowed 2 seeds in for our broccolis, our cauliflowers, our cabbages, then we want to wait until they grow their first set of true leaves. And these haven't done that yet, but we can already see that one is definitely stronger than the other one. The leaf development on this one's a lot bigger. It's a little bit taller. And so once they get that true set of leaves, then we're going to go ahead and nip the weaker of the 2 out. We don't want both of these growing and competing for the root system and the nutrients, because then they don't produce as good or as big of a broccoli head or cauliflower head or whatever you've got. We want to just leave one in there. And so we'll clip this out a little bit later. So we probably got a couple of weeks before we're actually going to be doing that with this guy. For our lettuce here, we have several coming up here. It looks like we got about 6 or 7 seeds in here. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave this because this is just fine to be able to let it grow to full stage and then transplant it directly outside. So there's no reason to do anything with this guy. This is our flat of onions that we started 10 days ago as well. And you can see that they're just barely starting to come up. This was not on a heat mat, whereas these guys were started at the same time. They're on a heat mat and they're so much bigger. So there again, you can see that the heat mats are a big advantage. But these guys are going to go ahead and live in these little cells and their flats for another probably 12 weeks before they're ready to be transplanted out. These here were started 8 weeks ago, and they're almost getting to the size to where we can get them transplanted out. These are some shallots, and so once they get to the size of almost a pencil, then I can harden these off and transplant them out into the garden. These seedlings are a really good example of why you should be using viable seed, and we talked about that in our part 1 of this series. You can see that there's a lot of yellowing going on. The leaves are kind of distorted. They've got different growth rates, and normally you might suspect that you've done something wrong or there's something wrong with the soil, but this is the same soil that I've grown for all of these starts. It's been grown on the heating mat with the rest of them with a light, and it still doesn't look near as good. But the one thing that I do know about this is really old seed, and this is what can happen. This is 12 or 14-year-old seed, and it just doesn't seem to perform as well. They did come up, but if I decide to spend my time and efforts in transplanting these, they're probably not going to produce really well. The only time that I would really want to save something like this is if it was an heirloom seed that was maybe gone extinct, that you've just found some awesome seed or something like that. But this might be just a waste of time and not produce very well. So I think I'm just going to toss these guys. This is another good example of how seeds grow and how quickly they germinate at different rates. So you can't expect all seeds to work the same way. So this is a cauliflower that was planted 10 days ago. Then we have our little tomatoes that were planted 10 days ago, and they're pretty small still. And then we have the jalapeno peppers, and they haven't even emerged up out of the soil yet. So be patient because they all come up at different rates. Circulation is essential for the health of your young seedlings. We've got an exhaust fan in our greenhouse, and that moves the air through nicely. Plus, we've got a circulation fan in the ceiling. This just creates more airflow, and it really helps with the health of your plants and strengthens the stems as well. Now, if you're indoors and you don't have these luxuries, then you can just use a regular portable fan and move it from side to side. This movement just helps strengthen those stems, and it makes strong cells so that when they go outside, that they don't snap right off at the first breeze. You don't have to turn your fan on full blast to make this work. Just a light breeze is good enough. I found that when I haven't had circulation versus when I have had circulation, that it really helps with the problem of damping off. And this is where the air is stagnant, and the airflow kind of helps that soil dry out and make sure that we don't end up with any fungal diseases on the stems of those little seedlings. Another thing that I really like to do to help strengthen the stems of those plants is just run my hand across them once or twice a day. I just move them back and forth, and that just kind of creates some movement for them, and it makes those cells a lot stronger. I guess you could call that getting in touch with your plants. There's no need to fertilize for the first 2 weeks once your seeds have germinated, because those seedlings have everything that they need to sustain life for the first 2 weeks. Plus, the soil that you use usually has enough food in it as well. But after 2 weeks, or after they've had their first set of true leaves, then I start to fertilize. But I don't like to over-fertilize. Less is more, and more often is best. I use a weak solution of all-purpose liquid fertilizer for all of my seedlings, and I like to use half dose. So if it calls for 2 tablespoons per gallon of water, then I'm only going to be using 1 tablespoon per gallon of water. And I like to feed my seedlings 2 to 3 times per week. This just supplies them food throughout that week, and it gives them a nice growth to create good cell structure and a good strong stem. With fertilizing, I just use a water can to fertilize my little seedlings, and I just pour it right over the top of those seedlings and just soak it into the soil. For mixing your fertilizer, just put your concentrate in your water can and then put the water over the top of it. That just helps agitate it up really well. Then pour it right over the top of your little seedlings until your soil is thoroughly wet. Another method to fertilize your little seedlings is just to use a tray and pour your diluted fertilizer in that tray and then put your pots right in that, and then they just absorb it up. Just make sure that they don't sit in that standing water. You might find that your seedlings are bent over or reaching in one direction, especially if you're growing in a windowsill. So all you got to do is just turn them from day to day, from side to side. This just helps them build a nice cell wall on each side of those and makes a stronger stem. So when you plant them outside, they're going to be a lot healthier and they won't be bent over permanently. There's lots of different grow lights out there, and if you're using one of the common mistakes is we raise those lights too high. So we want to keep those lights about 6 inches from those seedlings, and as they grow, we want to raise it. So it's really nice to have some way, some apparatus that we can raise those lights as those plants grow. Now, if you have a reflector, then you can be a little bit further away because that reflects the light down a little bit better. But there's all kinds of choices for lights, and so do read your instructions to make sure that you're keeping the right distance from your light. But as a rule of thumb, 6 inches away from the top growth of your seedlings is best. You don't want to leave your light on 24/7 because this isn't how it works in nature. And when you transplant them outside, then those little seedlings or those transplants are going to go through a major shock. So make sure that you put a timer on it, or if you're really good, to get out there and turn that light on and off and leave them on for 10 to 12 hours a day. That just mimics nature. We're off to a great start of getting our seedlings bumped up, fertilized, and strong. We'll see you in our part 4 of our seed starting series, Seedling Troubleshooting. Till next time, see ya!
Are you the most awesome gardener out there? Can you grow anything, anywhere? Can you out-garden your neighbors or even your wife? Then you should enter the All-American Greatest Gardener Anywhere contest and sweepstakes. Hello?
Oh yes, Kevin, you are a legend in your own mind. When you're done daydreaming, can you go to the grocery store like I asked hours ago?